My name is Grey Ghosthawk. At least my Native American name is that. I was given that by my teacher. And it's Grey Ghosthawk with one blue eye, which took me years to figure out that this was the blue eye, not because I got brown eyes. So it never made sense until, anyway. I'm going to start today with a little bit of talk on Native American spirituality in terms of being an earth-based spirituality. A lot of Native Americans don't like to use the word pagan associated with them, simply because of the negative connotation that comes with that in some people's opinions. My definition of pagan is an earth-based, non-Judeo-Christian spirituality, and Native American definitely fits into that because they're extremely earth-based, and they worship Creator, not God like most Christians or the Judeo-Muslimic situations. Not bad about any of them or anything like that, just different. The Native Americans obviously are very earth-based. They believed in a higher power. They called it Creator. It wasn't masculine or feminine, as a lot of religions do. But then the Native American is a spirituality, not a religion. In that religion has a dogma. Native Americans don't really have dogma. They just kind of let it roll as it goes. With that said, the Native Americans did worship Creator, but they worshiped everything else to get to Creator. They didn't worship animals per se. They didn't go out and pray to a bear or pray to an eagle or anything like that. They understood that Creator left messages and lessons within all things for them to learn. So they would pray to Creator to teach them the lesson the St. Oak Tree had of standing tall through the bad weather and all the rest of that stuff. They would get the message of a bear being strong and aggressive and able to, do what it did. And that's how they learned their lessons from Creator, by understanding that Creator, just like the word says, created all things. And in the process of creating everything, there's a little bit of Creator left in all things. And with that, that meant that they could then ask Creator to teach them that lesson, whatever that lesson may be. And it's just, they live their day to day, but they would always ask Creator for guidance and allow whatever. And through time, they learned things that they would pass on to their next generation so that they didn't have to do as much work to learn all those things because the previous generation had already learned it. That's what we're supposed to be today, but unfortunately we don't have. A lot of our younger people are making the mistakes that the older people have already made because they didn't want to listen to the older people. Natives didn't have that problem to the same extent. I'm sure there were young people there that said, well, I want to prove to myself that bear will eat me. And went out and got eaten by the bear because he wasn't smart enough to run from him or whatever. I think there's a lot of crazy stuff like that. And I like to make a few jokes here and there, but it's still legitimate native spiritual pathway. Some of the natives stayed more in touch with others in that they were more hunter-gatherer type people. They like the Plains Indians. Some decided to become more agrarian, like perhaps the Cherokee Nation or the Iroquois Nation, who settled into villages, domesticated crops and animals and such like that, and became very agrarian. That doesn't mean that they detached themselves from Creator at all, because they knew, based on climates, times of the year and such, when they could plant, when they could hunt, when they could fish, or this, that, or the other. They also learned how to plant their crops. And I'll bounce around here a little bit, but say, for instance, the Creek Indians. Everybody's heard of the Creek Indians. The real name of them is the Muskogee, and they were in the Alabama, southeastern United States area. They were called the Creek Indians by the French because they lived along creeks. French were not very imaginative, I suppose. But they would plant their crops. They were another agrarian society, and they would plant their crops, let's say, at the head of the river. The following year, they would move downstream a little ways and plant their crops. And then another year, they would move a little further downstream until 7 years later, and that was their particular thing because 7 is a very sacred number to the natives. they would move back to the first place and start the process all over again. Well, in that 7 years, that land they planted the first time has now had 7 years to replenish itself. The creeks are naturally going to flood and not flood. They're going to put nutrients back in, take contaminants back out, because that's the natural way the earth takes care of itself. The natives knew that, and they were able to keep good, viable, fertile land at all times. Unfortunately, when the Europeans got here, they discovered this paradise of fertile land and all that. Go to Europe and see how fertile the soil is there. They have essentially raped all the nutrition out of the land. That's why they have to use so much artificial fertilizer and so on and so forth, because they took all the natural nutrients out of the soil. The natives allowed that to re-happen. Here in the United States recently, let's go back to, I guess it was 93, 94, whenever they had the major flood along the Mississippi River. All those farmers were freaking out because their lands were flooded. The native peoples would say, "You're supposed to flood people. What's your problem?" They came and followed up the next year with some of the best crops they'd had in a long time. Why? Because the Mississippi flooded over that area and brought all that natural cleansing to the soil and replenishment to the soil with 1 year of flooding. All of a sudden, they had the best crop they'd had in a long, long time. And now I think they're realizing some of that. They've still built the levees back up so they won't flood, but that's how come we now have GMO corn, because they want to get 2 crops a year because there's no nutrition left in the soil. So they have to do whatever they can. And unfortunately, the human genome system hasn't caught up with the way we've played with the crops. That's why a lot of people have got these allergies to various different foods and such. Natives didn't have that problem because they didn't try and go ahead of nature. And that's where the whole, one of my teachers, a man named Sun Bear, who passed away many years ago, wrote a book about walking in balance. And that's what the natives did. They walked in balance with their fellow human beings, the rest of the animals on the planet itself. They never, if they went out hunting, for instance, first thing they would do would be to leave an offering to the Creator to have a good hunt. Usually it was cornmeal or tobacco, which are very sacred herbs and crops to the Native Americans. I'll explain some of that a little later, but they would leave an offering, and then they would go out hunting. And let's say they happened to be hunting deer. First thing they would do, the first deer they saw, they let go by. That way they always knew there was at least one deer out there for them to hunt, because the first one went by. The second one was fair game. But as soon as they took that deer, they would immediately say offerings of thanks to Creator for that deer giving of itself for their sustenance, and then they made sure they didn't waste anything from that deer. Obviously, they got meat to eat, and they didn't waste any of the internal organs. They'd eat the heart, the liver, the kidneys, and so on. They didn't waste anything. They had the hide, which they would then tan. Interesting thing about that, every animal on the planet, if you take its brains, there's enough brains in any animal to tan its own hide. So they would brain tan their hides. Didn't waste anything there. They would use the bones, obviously, for tools, sewing needles and such like that. They would use the ligaments and tendons from the muscles to make sinew, to sew all this stuff up. Okay? What they didn't utilize, because they couldn't list the intestines and stuff like that, went back into the ground for fertilizer. They just didn't throw it away. They would use it on their crops if they were agrarian society. If they weren't, they left it there for another animal to consume that would consume it. So nothing went to waste with them. And that's living in balance with the earth, which unfortunately, excuse me, in today's society, we seem to have gotten away from walking in balance. Now that means treating every person that you come across with the same respect that you would expect them to give you. That's walking in balance. We've gotten way away from that little trick. I'm sorry. I am a human. I can't deny it. But I'll also tell you the truth. Humans are basically idiots at times. without trying to be too cruel to us. We don't always think what our with a head that's clear. But then, like, say, for instance, the agrarian societies, when they planted their seeds, little thing about the Pilgrims, for instance, 1620, they come into Massachusetts, or what we now know as Massachusetts. And if they got there late in the year, they didn't have time to build homes. They didn't have time to plant crops. Well, it just so happens that that year, the Wampanoag Indians, which are the ones that were in that part of the country, had a bountiful crop, very plentiful, and the Pilgrims raided their storehouses and took food because they were living on the Mayflower. They didn't have a time to build other homes. They were living on the Mayflower, and unfortunately, a good portion of the people perished on the Mayflower because they froze to death. It's not like you don't just start a fire on a ship. That's not a good idea. And if they did start fires to stay warm, they didn't really have structures. Maybe they took some of the sails and made tents and such like that. But they lost a lot of their people that first winter because they didn't survive. Well, the Native Americans, who had a bumper crop, they had plenty of food. They survived. Whatever Pilgrims survived. But they said, okay, we're not going to let this happen next year. Guys, this is how you grow crops here. So they took them out. And if you've ever heard of the three sisters are beans, corn, and squash. And when they would plant their crops, they would put a bean seed, or a bean, a corn kernel, and a squash seed all in the same hole. And then they had the philosophy, you feed the earth and the earth feeds you. Well, they happened to be coastal Indians, so they had a lot of seafood. They ate a lot of fish. Well, they would take the fish entrails and such like that they couldn't eat, and they would lay that in the ground. Well, they didn't need a scientific explanation that says all that fish byproduct turns to nitrogen in the soil, which feeds the corn. The corn grows up nice and tall, allows something for the squash to hang from, leaving shade and protection for the beans to grow underneath. And the beans put a nutrition back into the soil that helps feed the squash. So it's a completely symbiotic situation. They didn't need some scientist to tell them all of that. Creator said, you feed the earth feeds you. So they would put all this fish entrails in there. That was their natural fertilizer. Again, nothing went to waste. What they couldn't eat, if they couldn't use the skeletons of the fish or whatever, that went into the soil. It's going to break down and put nutrients into the soil. They didn't have depleted land. Keep getting back to that because they took care of the land. They walked in balance with the earth. And they allowed Creator to teach them these lessons, which unfortunately modern religion has forgot that connection to, let's call it God, Yahweh, whatever word you want to use. I use the word Creator because it makes the most sense to me and the way my teachers taught me. It's, God created all things, says so in the Bible. You don't believe it, read the Bible, if you can believe the Bible. But so what better word to use than the word Creator? As I'm saying, Creator created all this. And again, going back to the beginning, Creator left a lesson in all things for us to learn if we're willing to open up and allow nature to speak to us. Another thing that we as humans have tended to get away from. Go back to the agrarians for a second. When they would go out to pick their crops, they'd already planted them right with the proper fertilizers that are natural fertilizers, of course. But if they went out to pick wild berries, for instance, before they left, again, they would make offerings to the earth to allow them a good harvest of whatever they were going after, whether it was berries or, say, apples if they were in that part of the country, or whatever, nuts, pecans, walnuts, chestnuts, whatever like this. And they would ask for a bountiful crop, but they would never take more than a third of what was there. That left a third for the animals to consume and another third to go to seed, so there'd be more crops the following year. I mean, you go out and pick all the blueberries off of a bush, that bush may die, and then you've got no more berries. But if you leave a third of them there, they fall on the ground. Some of those are going to develop into new bushes, and eventually you got a lot of bushes. And there's going to be continually, every year, more and more bushes. So those that die away, there's something to replace it. And you have got new crops of blueberries or raspberries or whatever crop it might have been, just to use that term. And that's where so many people get very confused. They didn't, they said, well, you got all this berry, why waste them? They weren't going to waste. The animals have still got to eat. And like they learned another lesson from a bear. Anything a bear can eat, a human can eat. Most people don't realize that. They would follow bears around, see what berries were dangerous. If a bear will eat this berry or that nut or that fruit from a tree, humans can eat it. So it's a good lesson to learn from the bear. And if they make prayers to the Creator that the bear won't kill them while they're watching, and the bear doesn't feel threatened, he'll guide them to all the food they need. Okay? Deer, humans don't eat a whole lot of grass and such like that, but there's a lot of things that deer do eat that we can eat. But then a bear's digestive system is more closely related to humans than a deer's is. So they would just take the deer down. But again, they did their prayers to it. They made definite offerings to the deer to give them the nourishment, the supplies, and everything they got from that animal. And I say deer, I'm using that as an example. Doesn't matter whether it could have been a raccoon, could have been a bear, could have been a buffalo, whatever. Buffalo, for instance, in the Lakota tradition, stands for abundance. Pretty good explanation of a buffalo, one of the largest land animals we've got in North America. Needless to say, a tremendous amount of meat, a whole lot of hide, a whole lot of bones, a lot of sinew, everything else. One of the greatest things that they had. A lot of people don't know this about the natives, but to give you an idea of the way they worked, the Lakota Indians, which are what we call the Sioux, the Plains Indians, originally started between the Iroquois Confederacy in the north and the Cherokee Nation in the south, in the Delmarva areas where the Lakota were. They were Eastern Woodland Indians. This is prior to Europeans coming in. Well, when the Europeans came in, the buffaloes started moving west. Well, they had started moving before that. Because of the agrarian society, the buffalo were kind of pushed out of areas. The Lakota just followed them out west. Further west they went, further west the natives went. But they followed the buffalo because that's where their primary food source was. They were hunter-gatherers. I mean, there was a time, and I'm sure everybody's heard about it, where the plains were blackened with so many buffalo. And it wasn't until the Europeans got out there, backed their trains in, pulled out their guns, and shot every buffalo they could shoot. And they'd have piles of buffalo skulls 100 feet high or so. Think how big that is at the base, and how many buffalo got killed to make that 100-foot high pile of skulls. And the natives were absolutely horrified to see the waste that was going on. Now, initially, they didn't waste too much. They took the meat back. They took the hides back. They made the buffalo robe coats and everything else like that. There's only so many people that wanted a big old heavy buffalo coat. If you live in Georgia, you don't need a buffalo coat. If you live in Virginia, you don't need a buffalo coat. You live in Massachusetts, you live in Pennsylvania, upstate New York, it might come in handy because it's pretty darn cold up that way. But so then they got to the point where the only thing that the people back east wanted were the tongues. That was considered some kind of a wild delicacy. And they'd eat buffalo tongue. They'd go out there and shoot a buffalo, cut its tongue out, leave the rest of it there to rot. Let me tell you, the natives were horrified. It's not surprising that they attacked natives, white Americans, Europeans, Americans, whichever word you want to use. The white man was not appreciated by the natives because the white man did not appreciate Mother Nature, didn't appreciate what Creator left us. And they saw what was being done. They would chop down a forest to build a city. We're still doing that. Look at the Amazon. And those are Native Americans in the Amazon just as much as the Lakota is in the plains. Last time I checked, South America was part of the Americas. Guess what? We're chopping down the rainforest to make room for cattle and stuff like that, and we're destroying God knows what down there just simply to satisfy a particular need. Whereas if we hadn't chopped down the rainforest, went in there and researched it, probably more food could be developed without destroying the rainforest than they can by raising cattle. Who knows how many animals they put extinct chopping down those rainforests because you took their habitat away, or what kind of medicines might have come out of that. Because every day they're discovering new stuff in the rainforest, not just South America, but in Africa, rainforest. Even up near Seattle, they have a rainforest there. There's all kind of new stuff they can discover there. Every continent's got a rainforest of some description. The one that contributes most to the global atmosphere is Africa and South America. They're two of the largest rainforests. Talking about the rainforest, the medicines that are possible, every continent's got them. The world is dependent upon the rainforest. They don't call it rainforest because it creates dust like the Sahara Desert. It's called rainforest because it creates rain for the entire planet. It absorbs all the CO2 that we keep putting into the planet, giving us oxygen. Last time I checked, the humans need a whole lot of oxygen to live. And without walking in balance, keeping everything together, the planet can't possibly produce enough oxygen for all of us. And this latest crazy thing going on, the reason why we have this little video going on, we haven't been walking in balance with the viruses either. And all of that makes a difference. And there may be a cure for all of this in some Chinese rainforest out there, but they're destroying all the Chinese rainforest no different than they're destroying the rest of them. And perhaps Creator has just said, and Mother Nature got together with Creator and said, let's thin out the herd a little bit here. I've been saying that since January, February, that this thing, because they started talking about being bad, maybe Mother Nature's thinning the herd. Again, walking in balance. We've got become too populated on the planet. Maybe the planet's thinking we're nothing but a bunch of fleas on our back, and she's going to shake us off. Look at all the earthquakes, the floods, the tsunamis, volcanic things, hurricanes, massive tornadoes, and all droughts and everything else that's happening. Watch some of the science on television. Read books. Heaven forbid we might read, but read a book. You can discover that all of these things are intertwined. And the more we forget about that, the more we don't walk in balance, the worse things are going to get. And Black Elk, who was a Native American, Lakota Native American medicine man who was at the Battle of Little Bighorn, just to frame the time frame, against Custer, came up. He lived to be almost 90 years old, died in the 40-something. But he was saying we all have to live under the tree of life. All these people, he had a vision that all the four tribes, the white, the yellow, the black, the red, would all come together under the tree of life and live in balance on the planet again. This was a gentleman born in the 1800s, something like, died around, I think, 1945 to 50, somewhere in that neighborhood, was around 90 years old. Nobody listened to him. It's a great book. If you ever want to read it, read Black Elk Speaks. It's a fabulous book about his life, from being in the wild with the tribes before the reservation time to his time with Buffalo Bill and Wild West Show touring Europe. So it's a good read, but if you look at what he talks about in his spiritual pathway, it's walking in balance. Sun Bear wrote a book called Walking in Balance. Another fabulous book about the native spirituality on it. I can give you a whole list of bibliography. Frank Foolscrow wrote a great book, and he was a nephew of Black Elk. Black Elk's considered by some the best, the greatest medicine man of the pre-reservation and early reservation times, and Foolscrow, the greatest medicine man of the reservation times up to modern times. To give you an idea, Foolscrow pushed the Native American, or the Freedom of Religion Act in America, 1978, was the first time it was legal for the Native Americans to practice their own spirituality. Up until 1978, they could be arrested for doing Sundance ritual, sweat lodges, all kind of stuff, because they were not mainline religious ceremonies. So they did their ceremonies secretively so that nobody could find them. 1978, Foolscrow went to Washington, pushed hard and hard and hard, probably much before 78, but Freedom Religion Act 1978 is what he got through. He walked in balance. Nature heard him. and got some of those guys in Washington to listen, and they passed the law. But they still, they still get a lot of people that don't want to do that, don't want to follow those kind of teachings. And that becomes a problem and gets us away again from that balance in nature that we should be cooperating with. And I'm getting close to time. I need to get out of here. I will be there online this coming Sunday when we do the talk. I'd be happy to answer any questions any of you might have about any of this or anything to do with the Native Americans. If I have the answer, I'll be more than happy to give it to you. If I don't have the answer, I'll go look it up. Because like something, I do read. I don't know about the rest of the world, but I do read. And I've got a decent library where I can find a lot of this kind of stuff. But until Sunday, good to see you guys, and we can talk then.